live streaming it, so we'll have thousands of other people listening to this talk. So this is the second of 5 public speaker series, and so we're wanting to share the history of the Faculty of Medicine, and I think the Honorable Edward Roberts probably has the inside scoop and has actually known more about the beginnings of the school than anybody in the province. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the Honorable Edward Roberts. So Edward Roberts has 53 years of service to Newfoundland and Labrador. He was elected as a Liberal to the House of Assembly in 1966, and Mr. Roberts served 23 years in the House in a variety of ministerial posts. He also became a practicing barrister and senior partner at one of the largest law firms in the province and was appointed a Queen's Counsel. His connections with Memorial go way back. Aside from his contribution to establishing the Faculty of Medicine, which I'll let him tell you all about, Mr. Roberts was chair of the Board of Regents of Memorial University from 1997 to 2002. He was a Lieutenant Governor of the province from 2002 to 2008, is a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Newfoundland and Labrador. Memorial University conferred an honorary degree upon him in 2003, and the Newfoundland and Labrador branch of the Institute of Public Affairs of Canada selected him to receive the Lieutenant Governor's Award for Excellence in Public Administration for 2010. Mr. Roberts was the first elected individual to be so honored by this branch. He was also honorary Colonel of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment from 2003 to 2008. Mr. Roberts has a passionate interest in the history of Newfoundland and Labrador. Of note, in 2006, while Lieutenant Governor, and after being awarded an honorary degree in 2006, he earned a Master's of Arts in Newfoundland History and was appointed a Fellow of the School of Graduate Studies. Memorial University's Alumni Association named him Alumnus of the Year for 2009. We are very pleased to welcome Mr. Roberts back to the Faculty of Medicine and to Memorial this evening, and we're very much looking forward to hearing his perspective on the medical school's impact on Newfoundland and Labrador's healthcare system. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Dean Steele, for those very kind words. Maybe I should quit while I'm ahead, right? And to me, the most interesting item in a somewhat varied and chaotic CV is that, as far as I know, I am to date the only person to receive an earned degree from Memorial after receiving an honorary degree. And I'm not sure what that means, but a little late starting. But may I begin by saying I'm pleased you're here. I was wondering how many would come at 5 o'clock on Fines, but all the important people are here. So thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking most warmly Dean Steele and her colleagues who organized these celebrations. This is the second time I've been asked to join in commemorating the establishment of the medical school here at Memorial, and the Faculty of Medicine as it's now known officially. I suspect that the decision of the Dean and her colleagues may simply reflect the fact that I'm the only one still standing of those involved in making the final decisions that led to the creation of the school and the Health Sciences Center. So I was quick to accept the invitation, as I did the first one some 10 years ago. I've always believed that my part in the creation of the medical school is by far and away the most important of any of my achievements, or for that matter, any of my failures, over the half century since I went to work with Mr. Smallwood, Premier Smallwood, in May 1964. It was my extraordinary good fortune, and it was good fortune, to be one of the handful, not all of us politicians, I hasten to add, who were there when the medical school began. Our aim was to provide the best possible healthcare services to the people of our province. And please bear that in mind. We didn't set out to build a medical school. We set out to build the best, to do what we could to improve and make the best possible healthcare services for our people. Transforming the education of medical doctors in Newfoundland from a dream to a reality was a powerful means to the goal. But the school was only one part, an essential part, I hasten to say, but even so, only one part of the efforts to do so in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And those were the transformative years in the history, the recent history of medicine in this province. Dean Rourke asked me to speak at the 40th anniversary celebrations, which was October 22nd, 2007. I did so at some length, I fear. My text ran to just under 5,000 words. I hasten to add, not tonight. And lest the thought crosses any of your minds, I'm not going to repeat tonight what I said then. Let me say simply that I've reread my notes and that I have no hesitation in reaffirming now what I said then about how the medical school came to be. I ended that talk by quoting from the letter that I sent to Stephen Lord Taylor, who was then Memorial's president, in July 1971. Either the letter or a copy of it, I'm not sure which, subsequently framed, and it's hanging somewhere here in the building, Dean Steele confirms. So we'll go and light little candles underneath it in due course, okay? Briefly put, in that letter, I told Lord Taylor that thanks to John Munro, who was then Canada's Minister of National Health and Welfare, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador had at long last been assured that the government of Canada would provide the financial support that we needed to make it possible for us to build the physical facilities for the medical school. And again, I emphasize the physical facilities. Those facilities were the nucleus of today's Health Science Centre, the General Hospital, and the academic and research facilities that today house the Faculty of Medicine and other ancillary institutions, but those were the original ones. Tonight I want to talk about two other aspects of the whole story of the medical school. The first is, why was it built? And the second is, what has it accomplished during its first 50 years? The starting point for any realistic suggestion to develop a medical school at Memorial was the recommendation in 1964 by a federal royal commission led by Mr. Justice Emmett Hall, a judge of the Supreme Court of Canada, that recommended that Canada needed more medical schools and that one of those should be located in Atlantic Canada. His Lordship, Mr. Justice Hall, did not, and his colleagues did not go beyond Atlantic Canada. That was coupled with a recommendation that the Government of Canada set aside $500 million for a health resources fund, which would be used to support those new schools. Led by Mr. Pearson, the Prime Minister at the time, the federal government was quick to accept the recommendation to create the fund. In its final form, $400 million was to be made available on a per capita basis to the provinces, on condition they matched federal dollars. $75 million was to be held for projects of national significance, and $25 million was set aside for Atlantic Canada, an acknowledgement of the fact that at that time there was only one medical school in the four Atlantic provinces, and that was the well-established one at Dalhousie, which had produced many, many doctors, including my father, my uncle, my brother, and others. The whole Commission's recommendation came as no surprise, either to the Newfoundland government or to Memorial. As early as September 1963, by which time the Commission had been appointed and was at work, discussions were underway in St. John's about a medical school at Memorial. The university appropriately took the lead in those through Mose Morgan and Ian Rusted. I assume I don't need to identify those names further, but Mose Morgan and Ian Rusted, both of whom I knew very well. A preliminary report was written in May 1964, but it wasn't until the provincial government's appointment early in 1965 of Russel Brain, a name you've forgotten, of Russel Brain as a one-man royal commission, that the proposal began to move to reality. Brain's precise mandate, and I'm reading now from the Order in Council, required him to make a survey of the medical services and hospital facilities throughout Newfoundland and Labrador, and to inquire into and report upon any circumstances in connection therewith which, in his opinion, should be brought to the notice of the Lieutenant Governor and Council. Formal wording, but in more common parlance, Brain was asked to provide a plan for the next stages in the development of all of Newfoundland's health services, not only a medical school. And this is the point where I should say a word or two about Russel Brain. The Right Honourable Lord Brain, he was a baron, he was made a knight by the Queen, he was made a baronet by the Queen, and in due course he became a baron, a member of the House of Lords. The peerage is still extant. His son is the Lord Brain today. The Lord Brain I'm talking about, the first Lord Brain, was an eminently qualified and universally recognized physician. It's only a coincidence, a very happy one, I must say, but nonetheless a coincidence, that a man whose family name was Brain would become a world-renowned neurologist. I mean, you couldn't write that in a movie. They'd say, don't do it. Early in 1965, Mr. Smallwood and his colleagues, the cabinet, decided to appoint a number of royal commissions to offer advice on the future of the province. There was one on economic prospects, for example, and another on transportation, to name just two of them. Dr. Max House, whom many of you knew well, and I'm delighted Mrs. House is with us tonight, suggested that to Mr. Smallwood that Lord Brain would be a superb choice to look into health-related issues. And as always, there was a reason behind it. Max had done his postgraduate work in Britain with Lord Brain. It was a brilliant suggestion, and not the least of Max House's contributions to the development of the medical school and to healthcare in general. And Mr. Smallwood never hesitated to act on an idea that he considered to be beneficial to the province. Early in 1965, he made an appointment to see Brain in London. I was with him on the day he met his lordship. I took no part in the conversation between the two men, of course, but I have a very clear and strong recollection of their meeting. His lordship received us in what was obviously his study, his working space. It was a small table or two or three upholstered armchairs in what appeared to be a living room. Very strange doctor's office, but this was where he worked. And yes, it was in Harley Street. It's number 86 to be precise. Mr. Smallwood made his pitch with all his usual eloquence. Lord Brain was taken aback, to put the matter gently, and his first response was that he did not think he could do justice to such a mandate. But as the two men talked, it became obvious that he was becoming interested in the notion. And when he left after an amiable discussion, although neither tea nor sherry were offered, Mr. Smallwood told me as we waited on the street for one of the famed London black cabs that, "I think we've got him." It was a happy moment for the province and for Memorial. Brain proved to be precisely the right man in the right place at the right time. Lord Brain's commission was dated the 8th of February 1965. Mose Morgan, Dr. Rusted and their colleagues, who'd been working in a preliminary way, pressed ahead with their work, and in June 1965 they asked Dr. Joseph McFarlane to chair a group which was called the Feasibility Condition. It had representatives from the government, the Newfoundland Medical Association, and the Board of Regents. Dr. McFarlane was for many years the Dean of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine. He'd retired by then, and he had been an important advisor to the Hall Royal Commission. Parenthetically, let me add now that I had a very slight acquaintance with Dean McFarlane. In 1957-58, I was at the U of T in the first year of the pre-med course. At the end of the year, it had become obvious to me, and I've no doubt to the Dean, that whatever talents I had would be better served by my enrollment in another faculty. Anyway, that led me over the next 6 years to the Faculty of Arts, the School of Graduate Studies, and the Faculty of Law, all at the University of Toronto, but that's another story. In any event, McFarlane and his colleagues set to work, and in due course produced a report. Memorial's representatives made a major contribution to Lord Brain's report. And if any of you is interested in the history, it's worth reading Brain's report. First of all, it's very short, very much to the point, very lucid, very literate, eloquent, and accurate. The university folks worked closely with him. Now, they were lobbying, seeking the creation of a faculty of medicine. Well, fine. And they wanted a university teaching hospital as part of that. That was fine too. Brain's focus was on a much broader focus. Brain's focus on the much broader issues of public policy, because that's what he was asked to address. But the two complemented each other, and I mean COMPL-EMENTED as well as COMPL-IMENTED, even though they were looking at from two very different lenses. The two vantage points met and merged. Lord Brain's report, which was in January 1966, 11 months. I mean, hard to believe a royal commission would produce anything except bills in 11 months. Lord Brain's report made the point strongly, clearly, and effectively. He recommended that Newfoundland build a medical school. But he also pointed out something else. And I want to stress these words. The capital outlay must inevitably be heavy. I hope, Brain said, that this may be generously supported from federal sources. Now, we've had by this stage, the Hall report was public. Not only because a new medical school in Newfoundland would be fulfilling the recommendation of the Hall Royal Commission, that's stretching a little, that more medical schools should be established, but also because of the direct benefits to medicine and public health, which I am convinced a medical school in St. John's would confer on the province. He concluded that part of his discussion with, I can imagine no more rewarding investment in public welfare and happiness than to build a medical school. Well, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that those words were the trigger that brought the university's proposal to fruition. On the 25th of November 1966, Mose Morgan, who was then the university's president pro tem, we were awaiting the descent of Lord Taylor upon us, Mose wrote formally to the government to request that a medical school be established. He worked the way through the university, the Board of Regents, and the letter came in. Mr. Smallwood's reply was dated the 18th of April, 1967. And if I may be allowed another personal note, by then I was the Premier's parliamentary assistant, a position which I combined with my role as the member of the House for White Bay North. I drafted that letter, based, of course, on Mr. Smallwood's instructions. He signed it, but the words are mine. Now, Brain in his recommendations had added that, again I quote, assuming the proposal to have a medical school at St. John's is adopted, there should be a university hospital. Now, I'm sure there were hosannas over in the Arts and Administration building at those words. But then he went on, which should A, act as a provincial medical referral center, B, provide undergraduate and postgraduate medical education and the education of paramedical workers, and C, act also as a regional hospital by providing medical care for the community of St. John's, and D, undertake medical research. I don't think there were any hosannas on the campus with that. And Brain went on to say, this new university hospital should be managed by a governing body appointed by the Minister of Health after consultation with the appropriate authorities and bodies. So there it was, a medical school and a teaching hospital, but the teaching hospital was not to be under the aegis and direction of the medical school. Now let me put those recommendations into the context of the reality of healthcare in our province when they were made, 1966. The government had no hesitation in accepting the proposal to create a medical school. But that decision did nothing to deal with the other great problem in our healthcare system at the time, one which was very much in the minds of the ministers and more to the point, their officials. Two issues dominated healthcare policy in the province in the latter part of the 1960s. One, without question, was the number of practicing doctors. That was the easy one to understand. That's the one that we heard about all the time. But the other, even more important, was the issue of the general hospital. And I mean the facility now known as the Miller Centre. Well, part of it's known as the Miller Centre. The back wards, Shea and Crowdy and all of Cowan and those wards were behind it. They were a disaster. Let me expand upon the statement about the general. There was no question ever that the university must have a teaching hospital. Although many of the local doctors opposed the idea of a medical school because they realized that the medical school would end up quite appropriately controlling most of the beds in those hospitals, which they saw as an economic blow to them. But equally, there was no question that there must be a base hospital for the province. To put the point simply, the General Hospital here in St. John's, which was the province's only tertiary care facility, had long outlived its usefulness. It had to be replaced. Earlier, the government had acknowledged the need for very large capital expenditures for healthcare facilities. Substantial investments had been made in the Grace Hospital, and major additions were underway at St. Clair's. St. Clair's one still stand, the Grace has been torn down, except for the former nursing school, which is a disaster waiting for a chance to happen. The government had also authorized expansion of the Western Memorial Hospital in Conabrook, the building of a new hospital on the north shore of Conception Bay, ended up at Carbonear, and work at the Waterford, which was then known as the Hospital for Mental and Nervous Diseases, or the Mental in common parlance. As an aside, that's the only substantial work that's been done on the province's basic psychiatric institution in 50 years. The great problem was to develop a mechanism that would meet the university's legitimate needs for access to teaching, clinical teaching facilities, if that's the right phrase, as well as fulfill the government's legitimate responsibilities to provide facilities for health care for the people of the province. I became Minister of Health in June 1969. By September 1970, discussions between my officials, to use the official language, and representatives of the university led to the appointment of a committee to try to resolve the dilemma. That committee, Mose Morgan, Dr. Leonard Miller, who had been Deputy Minister of Health for more than 20 years, and Campbell Eaton, who was chair of the General Hospital Board, had agreed upon a solution, a new general hospital. Here's how I described this arrangement to the Cabinet. The paper was dated 20 January 1971. We knew our time was running out. We weren't going to run away from this one. The solution is to phase out the present General Hospital as an active care hospital and to replace it with a new General Hospital facility to be built on or near the university campus. At that stage, I don't think the campus had come across the parkway. The new hospital would be built as both a teaching hospital and a general hospital. Although it would be used for teaching purposes, it would be under the control of the board appointed by us and not under the control of the university. Bracket, I intend the present board of the General Hospital to be this board, close bracket. The new hospital would have approximately 400 beds, and in addition to teaching facilities, it would provide the basic emergency and outpatient services for the St. John's area, and in every sense replace the present General Hospital and provide teaching facilities in addition. The solution would solve our problems with respect to clinical teaching facilities and with respect to the need to provide basic facilities for the province. So those were the crucial decisions. And it wasn't until January 1971 we got that far. Cabinet accepted the recommendation. Dean Rusted, first of Margaret Steele's predecessors, acknowledged it very generously. His words, the compromise had required full discussions, that was an understatement, at informal meetings attended by the Minister of Health, Mose Morgan, and the Chairman of the Board of the General, Campbell Eaton. All of them, fortunately, far-sighted people. But the policy issue was resolved, but there was still a hurdle. We had to find the money. The money to pay for the construction of the new General Hospital and whatever facilities the medical school needed. At that stage, I think they were operating out of the temporary buildings which were across the parkway. I think the university, the library parking lots have now gone into that space. The passage of 50 years has clouded memories. But let me remind you, and for those of you who weren't around then, let me tell you that the money issues, to use the Duke of Wellington's description of the Battle of Waterloo, were, quote, the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life, close quote. It wasn't a done deal. The estimated capital cost of the new facilities, the hospital and the university teaching facilities, was 45 million, which is approximately $300 million, I'm told, in 2017 figures. That may seem like a minuscule amount in an era when the government spends $8 billion a year, the province spends $8 billion a year. unfortunately doesn't have 8 billion a year in revenue, but that's another story. But it was a huge sum in the context of the 1970s. I looked up the records. In 1970-71, I asked the House of Assembly on behalf of the ministry, the Smallwood ministry, to approve a total expenditure of just under $72 million for the Department of Health. And that covered everything, current and capital. The Health Department's 2017-18 budget, approved by the House this spring, is $3 billion, nearly 42 times as much. The budget for Medicare, essentially the doctors, in 1970-71 was 3.9 million, while the cost for the current financial year is estimated at nearly 500 million, more than 125 times larger. So I mean, put it in context. 45 million was a big chunk of change, I can tell you, in 1970-71. The problem had become all the more pressing because the university had acted upon the government's commitment as set out in Mr. Smallwood's letter. That's fine. The first students were admitted in 1969. There was no teaching hospital. They worked in the existing city hospitals. And they graduated in 1973, at least those who made it through in the regular 4 years. By mid-1970, as I just said, the working estimate of the cost of the health science complex, the general and the teaching facilities, research facilities, was 45 million. Cabinet, after taking advice from our own officials and from our outside financial advisors, had concluded that we required 30 million from Ottawa, from the Health Resources Fund. Well, that's 500 million. What's 30 million? The problem that arose was we were told by Ottawa and our fellow provinces that we could have no more than 20 million. We were 10 million short. That's not even a rounding error in the government's finances these days, but it was a great deal of money in 1971. Speaking for the province, I had warned the appropriate ministers in Ottawa repeatedly that if we didn't get the full 30 million, we would not be able to proceed with the medical school. Although I did not say so specifically, the fallback position would have been to improve the general hospital at a cost of 15 million. The medical school would likely have become a casualty of that. May seem strange, but that was the reality we had to face. We made no threats. There was nothing new in the statement of position. The April 1967 letter to President Morgan, or Acting President Morgan, said that without substantial assistance from the Health Resources Fund at Ottawa, the government would not be able to provide the university with the necessary funds. It was the university's decision to go ahead and enroll those students. It turned out to be a wise decision. It would have been interesting if it hadn't been. Alex Hickman, who was my immediate predecessor as the Minister of Health, wrote to John Munro in the end of December 1968, sort of a Happy New Year letter. It was dated the 31st of December. Gave as his opinion that unless the Government of Canada is prepared to provide approximately 31 million, the Health Science Centre at Memorial University will have to be cancelled. That greeted me when I came into the office as minister in the spring of '69. The Hall Commission, I said earlier, had recommended 500 million. I think that's enough money to cover that. What's 10 million among friends? My fellow health ministers from the other 3 Atlantic provinces had agreed that we could have 10 million of the 25 million set aside for our 4 provinces, a special chunk. And that's why you had New Brunswick students in the first years. We, as it were, pre-sold the university controlled admission standards, but I think it was 10 spaces a year for a number of years. And in return, I forget who was the minister in New Brunswick, but the other 3 ministers agreed to let us have 10 of the 25 million. So we owe New Brunswick, but we honored our debt. We took those students, and as far as I know, they did well. But it's a different arrangement now. That money from the 10 million and our per capita share of the 400 million, another 10 million, gave us 20 million. That's fine. But we were about 2.5% of Canada's population at that time. We're under 2 today, and it's dropping rapidly. And that 2.5% of the remaining chunk of 75 million would have been 3.3 reserved for projects of special importance. Well, we thought we were that. The numbers, 23 million, simply did not add up. Well, this is a story I've told before, and I'm not going to belabor it. John Munro, with strong encouragement and support from Don Jameson, who was our own minister, came to our rescue. He's never been given the recognition he deserves, in my view. John Munro decided, and it was his decision under the system, he was the minister, to allocate the full $10 million to our project. So we got the 30 million bucks, 6% of the national total. That was pretty heady stuff for a province with 2.5% of Canada's population. And the day I got the letter from John was the day I wrote the letter to Stephen Taylor to say, we're on. God alone knows what would have happened if we hadn't got it. It would have been very messy. Anyway, that's how the medical school and the new general hospital came to be a reality. I'm not sure the story's ever been told in full before. Maybe it'll never be told again. But let me add a short description about what they have meant to our province, which is the subject Margaret asked me to address. I have no hesitation in declaring that, in my judgment, the Health Science Centre, which the medical school and the general hospital in the original HSC, it's now been expanded, was the most important single development in the medical care for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador since medical doctors came here, likely with the Royal Navy more than 300 years ago. I'm not going to attempt to quantify what the medical school alone has meant, because I'm not sure that anybody has ever tried to measure this statistically. I'm not sure how you would. But I can tell you that there's been a very significant increase in the number of doctors practicing in our province. Alex Hickman, in the letter I quoted a few minutes ago, told John Munro that our doctor-patient ratio was 1 to 1,900, as compared to the national average of 1 to 900. And that was in 1968. Our ratio now is among the best in Canada. We have 1 doctor for every 1,200 of our people, which is 245 for every 100,000. The national average is 228 per 100,000. The only province that has a better ratio than do we is Nova Scotia, which has 261 doctors for every 100,000 people. And those aren't my figures, those are the CIHI's, Canadian Institute for Health Management's figures. So we hear complaints all the time about a shortage of doctors. I'm not saying there's not validity to them, but the fact remains that we have, according to these figures, which I assume are correct, they're official if you believe what the government tells you, we are the second best doctor-patient ratio in the country. And that would not have happened without the medical school. But these figures don't tell the real story. Since Dean Steele asked me to speak and we agreed on a topic, I've spoken with some of those working in the province who are best qualified to offer a sound opinion on the matter. The gist of what they tell me is this: were it not for the medical school, its faculty members and its graduates, and the faculty members are just as important in this equation as the graduates, and were it not for the Health Science Centre in which they teach and learn, and in which they work, Newfoundland and Labrador today, in the healthcare sense, would be in almost exactly the same position that Prince Edward Island is with respect to Nova Scotia. We would be able to provide a basic level of service together with an intermediate level in some modern specialties and subspecialties. But there would have been very substantial specialties, areas of secondary and tertiary care, which could not be provided in this province. Everybody who required those services would have needed to leave the province to get them. Today, some still have to do so, but they're a very small part of the whole. And that, in one sentence, in my view, is what the school has accomplished in its first 50 years. Leonard Miller, Dr. Len Miller, was my deputy minister, and I was truly blessed. I learned from him early on that one of the basic, perhaps the basic, factor in the delivery of healthcare services is the number of people in the catchment area. Sounds like a bit of a technical term, but I guess it's accurate. It's really a very simple concept. Many brilliant ideas are. The greater the level of skill necessary to deliver a particular medical service, the larger the population that must be available to support it. For example, we can, and we are, I'm told, providing the people of the province with very advanced cardiac services at the General Hospital here in St. John's. It would not be possible to provide a comparable service anywhere else in the province. And I could go through a whole range of other medical specialties, I'm told, and make the same comments. Medicine is infinitely more complex today than it was when the medical school was founded 50 years ago. There were 500,000 of us in Newfoundland and Labrador then. And there are only 525,000 today. These are really very staggering figures. And we're very much older, and so we need a very much greater quantity of quality care. The best measure of what the medical school has meant for our people is that they can get a very large part of that care here. So that's it. When all is said and done, the story of Memorial's Faculty of Medicine is inseparably linked to that of the provision of healthcare services in the wider sense to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. Russel Brain was dead on when he said that I can imagine no more rewarding investment in public welfare and happiness than to build a medical school. Perhaps those words should be engraved and put on the front door somewhere. I can imagine no more rewarding investment in public welfare and happiness than to build a medical school. There's no one living in this province today, and I venture to say there's none who has lived here in the last half century, whose life is not much the better, or was not much the better, because of the medical school. Lord Brain may have said it best, but he wasn't the only one who helped to transform the dream of a medical school into reality. Every one of them deserves to be remembered. Thank you. Now you got questions?
So Dr. Roberts will be happy to take any questions.
I don't have an MCP card.
Yeah. You're okay.
I mentioned to you before you started the fact that Mr. McKechnie died.
Alan McKechnie, yeah. Great man.
What role would Medicare play in the introduction of the medical school or the fact that it's
Well, Medicare actually came into force here during my time as health minister. Pure coincidence, although my MCP card has a very low number on it, 00018 on the 245th day of the year. I tried to do 001, but some guys at the Medical Care Commission were smarter than me, or I. Medicare actually came almost simultaneously with these developments. For those of you who, Eve and I were both active young Liberals in those days, there was a rage. Mr. Pearson became Prime Minister in 1963, and the government of which he was the leader developed the concept of Medicare, which was not universally popular. Remember, Ontario didn't come in for a number of years. All about money. Most medical issues are about money in that sense. And the Liberal Party debated back and forth, and it wasn't until well on to 67, I think, that we began to see Medicare. For us, it was a great boon, because originally we received 1/2 the national per capita average, plus 1/2 our per capita expenditure in the province. And because the national average was far greater per capita than ours, for a couple of years we were actually, I won't say making money on Medicare, and it was all in the figures, but we were getting medical care for a great deal smaller amount of money than we would have had to spend under the old system. But so it was late 60s. I can't give you an exact date. I think the Medicare, look at your card, I think it came in on the 1st of April 1969. I became health minister. I became health minister in June '69. Anyway, I was health minister the day it came in. So it had an impact. The biggest impact was the idea that the government of Canada could participate nationally in what provinces said was a provincial responsibility. And of course the BNA Act, the guys who wrote it in 1866, fog of alcohol in London, had no notion of healthcare as such. So, and the Hall Commission helped to bring, the Hall Commission actually was the policy recommendation that led to Medicare. Mr. Diefenbaker, who was Prime Minister and appointed Mr. Justice Hall, who was a buddy of his from Saskatchewan, did nothing with the report. But I guess it came in, in fact, it came in after Mr. Diefenbaker had left office involuntarily, but he'd left. So it was sheer coincidence. But the health sciences, the Health Resources Fund came out of Hall, and Hall came out of the Medicare debate. That helped.
I'm just wondering whether the money that went into the capital was different from the funds that had.
Oh yeah, the 45 millions was quote capital close quote.
Not for operation.
No.
Was the Medicare fund used for that?
Well, you know, the doctors were paid out of Medicare, of course, and not Medicare is a plan, unless it's changed beyond my ken, to pay doctors remuneration, whether it's salary or a fee for service. And that money, it's no longer separate. It got muddled up in the early 2000s, but for years we got a sort of a transfer. There was also a hospital insurance program, which came in earlier on during Paul Martin's time as the Minister of Health and Welfare. But we were much better off financially because of the federal assistance. Anybody who knows more than that can straighten me out, but that's my recollection of events 50 years ago. Yeah.
Just
Sure.
to continue on the same question, so how was the medical service was provided before the Medicare came in?
With great difficulty. There were a number of plans. There were, here in St. John's, essentially it was fee for service. And my father was a doctor who practiced for many years here. And he was one of those who advocated for Medicare and for the medical school. Not all of them did. He wrote off, I've just given all his medical records to the university, which tells me they'll lock them up jealously. Very complete records of a very large practice, a group practice. He wrote off routinely a third of his bills, and I don't think that was unique. There was a cottage hospital system in large parts of the rural section of the province. People paid a relatively modest fee if they could afford it, and the cottage hospitals were built, starting with the commission in the mid-30s, and provided a level of medical care, pretty basic. Then there were all sorts of ad hoc arrangements. Twillingate had the Notre Dame Bay Memorial Hospital, St. Anthony and the northern Newfoundland and the coast of Labrador. There was nobody living in western Labrador in those years. Had the Grenfell Association, both of which received provincial help. There was the hospital insurance program. Conabrook and Grand Falls had hospitals provided in part by the paper mills in those towns, but there was a hodgepodge. And then there was a children's health program. I may not have the name correct, but the Smallwood administration in the early 60s brought in a program whereby the medical bills for children's health care were paid by the government. So there was a hodgepodge, and that may have been the reason we had, relatively speaking, few doctors. I don't know. But there was no universal scheme. And we spent a total of $70 million a year. You know.
Mentioned the last 50 years and the change that we've seen over that time, technology, medicine, changing demographics in the province. One of you would put your prescient hat on and see what the role of the medical school would be in this province in healthcare in the next
I don't expect to be around so I can wing it. Although you guys never know, you never know what you guys are doing. We will continue to need doctors, and that's one of the things the medical school does. But I always got angry and annoyed when people said, well, Jesus, we train them, they move away. And some do. That doesn't particularly bother me. The research that's done, I'm not sufficiently au fait enough to, but a number of areas where the medical school here has done research with a national impact. Just the improvement in the facilities, the reason I'm told by those who I believe know, so I'll take their word for it, that we can offer, I mentioned cardiac, there may be other, sir, I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert, I'm not, is because of the caliber of physicians or surgeons, whatever, who came here in part because of the medical school. So I can just see that growing. Now our problems, like so many, like our financial problems, are self-inflicted. I don't know what can be done about those. That's the real challenge. We're getting very much older, very much faster. And I used to talk about this at Government House. Nobody listened then, and maybe you don't want to hear more now, but Government House was nonpartisan, interesting and important. The one thing that no government can change are the laws of demographics. We know today how many people are going to be around in this province. You can set any parameters you want. We know how old they're going to be, and I think we can predict with a fair degree of accuracy what their healthcare needs will be. And the medical school in all its panoply, I think, is essential. I'd hate to think where we'd be without it. We'd be, I'm not trying to be down on Prince Edward Island, but we would be in relationship, the relationship between Newfoundland and the rest of the country would be, in the medical sense, roughly of the relationship of Corner Brook to St. John's today. I'm not trying to be unpleasant to Corner Brook, but they don't do a great deal there. They do what they can. They might like to do more. That's another issue. The medical school has made it possible to offer a very wide range of services. But this is where Len Miller's 500,000 people come in. You know, anybody wants to take me apart on that, try. Maybe you're right. But I had an immense respect for Dr. Miller. I was about his 15th minister. He trained us all. I can tell you a funny story about Len Miller. Some of you may have known him. I was fuming one day about something. I was the minister, right? Now, Len and Dad were contemporaries, colleagues, and friends in the days when there were 60 doctors in St. John's, 70 maybe. And I was fuming about something, and Len Miller said, well, he said, you don't need to worry, he said. I'm in charge of healthcare in this province. I looked at him. And I said, you know, I'm the minister. He said, yeah. He walked over and had a set of the statutes. He took down one and looked up what was then called the Revenue and Audit Act. There, he said, look at that. It says, the deputy minister shall be the head of the department. Anyway, no, I mean, we would be a much less medically capable society were it not for the medical school. And it's not simply the production of the doctors. I hope some of them stay, but I can tell you that wasn't the real reason. This is why when Margaret asked if I'd say a few words, this is why the real issue that we had to deal with in the government, the real issue was the healthcare facilities, not simply the doctors. We were getting doctors from Ireland and England. They all came here for 2 years. You could go across the country and find doctors who spent 2 years in Fogo. Jim McGraw used to go over for 6 weeks in Ireland. That's Dr. Jim. Not put up at is it the Shelburne Hotel the big hotel in Dublin? He used to take the deputy minister with him on occasion, John. They'd interview doctors. They'd come to work here, you know, Irish, well trained. They'd worked on a 2-year contract for 3 times what they were getting in Ireland. And the moment they got here, They started counting the days so they could leave because they get 3 times as much by going to a Western province in Canada. But, I don't know, that's not the case now. Anyway, don't get me started.
And that was music, your answer was music to Dr. Paterno's ears because he's a basic biomedical scientist, so we produce great researchers as well.
So you wouldn't have been here or there wouldn't have been a place for you without the medical school.
Absolutely correct.
Well, you thank Lord Brain. I don't know what would have happened if he, and we didn't write his report. Anybody who thinks that the government influenced Brain's report, Brain was a, strong-minded, very willful guy who wrote what he wanted. And when we first saw the report, I remember I wasn't even in the cabinet. I guess I was in Smallwood's office, saying, "This is it. This tells us what we need to know." Because there was a great row on over who ran the hospital. Anybody who knew Mose Morgan and Ian Rusted, to say they were strong-willed is perhaps putting it gently, right? How many of you here knew Mose? Most of you did, Well, Mose knew how to defend the position and do it ably. Anyway, the compromise has worked as far as I know. If it hasn't, blame Lord Brain.
Any other questions? So on behalf of everyone here, thank you for that eloquent speech around understanding the origins of the medical school. And also, if it wasn't for your writing, we wouldn't be here, so thanks very much. The other thing that we've talked about, and you mentioned it in your speech, was about John Monroe and recognition of his part to play. So we're actually looking for a picture of you and him together to frame.
I don't know if there is one, but get one of John. I was only the punt being towed by the schooner.
Maybe Eve has a picture, does she?
We were both young Liberals at the time. John was a...
Got a lot of memories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there may be some other types of pictures at the convention.
Well, let's see. But if not, something should be done to honor John.
So
He didn't
plan
have
on
to do
doing
it.
So we'll have some more conversations.
He did not have to do it.
Yeah.
And he took a lot of flack from and Don. If you could get one of John and Don together, it would be.
Okay.
With 2.5% of the population, we got 6% of the money. It's not bad.
It's a good return.
I'm not sure that all the premiers since then have done any better.
So thanks again, Dr. Roberts. I think it was great. I think it was really interesting to hear all the pieces and all the politics that had to go behind developing the medical school and the teaching hospital. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Oh, I got a loot bag.